In 1348, England faced a calamity that would forever change the course of its history. The Black Death, a plague so devastating it claimed the lives of nearly half the population, swept across the country, leaving a wake of death and despair in its path. Entire villages, once bustling with life, fell silent. The air was thick with fear, and the stench of death lingered over the land as mass graves were filled with the bodies of the fallen. Families were torn apart, entire communities lost, and a way of life that had endured for centuries was shattered in the span of mere months. But amid this horrifying destruction, England did not simply fall into despair. In the wake of the plague, a country crippled by loss found the seeds of its transformation. The Black Death did not just destroy, it also paved the way for radical changes in the fabric of English society. What emerged from the ashes was not just a return to normal, but a reforging of the nation itself. The survivors of the plague, those who were left to rebuild, found themselves in a world that was no longer bound by the same old rules. The labor force was decimated, leaving those who remained in high demand. The nobility, once the uncontested rulers of the land, found themselves facing a new reality, one in which the power dynamics had shifted. As the decades passed, England began to evolve in ways that would lay the groundwork for the modern world. From the struggles of the peasantry to the shifting tides of power among the nobility, the post-plague years would see a reconfiguration of society, one marked by greater social mobility, changing economic structures, and the beginning of a slow but steady rise of the working class. The once rigid class divisions began to blur, and opportunities that had been unimaginable before the plague slowly came into reach for those who had survived. This journey through the post-plague years of England is not just a story of recovery. It is a story of resilience, transformation, and adaptation. It is about how a society, shattered by an unimaginable loss, found ways to rebuild itself from the ground up. As we dive deeper into the impact of the Black Death, we will explore the extraordinary changes that began to take shape. From the rise of the peasantry to the decline of feudalism, the shift in religious authority, and the cultural upheaval that echoed through every corner of England. This is not just a tale of devastation, but of the emergence of a new England, one that would shape the future of the nation for centuries to come. So, join me as we look back at a country in crisis and witness how the seeds of a modern England were planted in the aftermath of one of the deadliest pandemics in history. In 1348, England was thrust into an abyss of devastation by the Black Death, a plague so deadly it wiped out nearly half of the population. The disease spread with terrifying speed, leaving an indelible mark on the country. Villages that once thrived with activity were abandoned, and the once familiar landscape was silenced by death. Entire families were gone, their homes empty, their crops rotting in the fields, and their livestock wandering untended. The plague did not just ravage the people, it shattered the very fabric of society, leaving a country in chaos. One vivid account from the time comes from a monk named William Dean, who described the haunting image of entire villages abandoned to decay, their homes crumbling in the aftermath. He recounted how the plague left no room for ceremony or care, and survivors were forced into unimaginable situations. In his words, there was nobody left who would bear the corpses to the grave. Men and women had to carry their own children to mass graves, laying them in the earth without any rites. The most devastating aspect of the plague was not just the death toll, it was the brutal, unforgiving reality of a society that could no longer tend to its dead. No clergy remained to perform the last rites, and those who survived had to endure their grief alone, without the comfort of ritual. In the days following the initial wave of the Black Death, survivors found themselves in an unimaginable situation. With the spiritual and social structure broken, it was clear that England had entered an era of profound change. Entire communities were wiped out in a matter of months, and those left behind had to navigate a new world, one where the familiar roles and rituals that once held the fabric of society together had disintegrated. What was left in the wake of the plague was not just a shattered nation, but a community left to grapple with loss and devastation on a personal and collective level. Let me take you to a small village near Canterbury, one of the hardest hit areas of England during the plague. According to historical records, this village was a microcosm of the tragedy that struck the entire nation. The plague had torn through the town with such ferocity that only a few survivors remained, and even they were barely clinging to life. These survivors, overwhelmed by grief and exhaustion, were forced to carry their own children to the mass graves, digging deep into the earth to lay them to rest. In some cases, these survivors were so weakened by the disease that they had to drag the bodies of their loved ones to the graves, their energy sapped by the sickness that had decimated their friends and families. This was not just a community destroyed by disease. It was a place where grief was compounded by the utter absence of care and ritual. The lack of clergy meant that no one was there to perform the comforting rites that had been a part of life for centuries. The societal norms that had once governed life in these communities, traditions, rituals, and a strong religious structure, were suddenly rendered irrelevant. Families, torn apart by loss, were left to mourn in silence, forced to confront death in a way that was foreign and unsettling. Imagine the despair that must have gripped those survivors. No comforting words from a priest, no prayers to ease the burden of their grief, no proper burial for their loved ones. The absence of ritual and the collapse of societal structures did not just affect those left behind in these small, devastated villages. It reverberated throughout the entire kingdom. As death took hold, there was no one to perform even the most basic duties. Bishop Ralph of Shrewsbury, writing in January of 1349, noted how many priests had died or fled in fear, leaving entire parishes without spiritual care. The lack of clergy became a pressing issue as the dead piled up, and the living, too exhausted to bury their own, were forced to take matters into their own hands. For many, the plague was not just a disease, it was a test of survival, both physically and emotionally. Without the structure of society to fall back on, people had to adapt, and their sense of what was right and customary was forever changed. In the absence of rituals, survivors had to create new ways to grieve and cope. They turned to one another for solace, sharing stories of their lost loved ones, seeking comfort in shared suffering. Yet, even in the face of such immense loss, they found themselves not only grieving but also struggling to rebuild their lives in a world that had forever been altered. As the years passed, survivors of the Black Death were forced to rebuild not only their villages and communities, but their very identities. The grief they experienced in those first months became a defining moment in England's history, shaping the cultural and social shifts that would follow. The personal loss was compounded by the larger societal upheaval. The old feudal systems began to unravel, power structures shifted, and economic dynamics changed. But through it all, England's people, those who survived, showed remarkable resilience. In the aftermath of the plague, The survivors were left to cope with their grief in their own ways. Some turned inward, becoming more devout, seeking solace in the belief that the plague was a divine punishment. Others turned outward, seizing the opportunity to demand better wages and working conditions, knowing that their labor was now valuable in a way it had never been before. The landscape of England changed, not just in terms of physical structures, but in terms of the very heart of the nation. What had once been a rigidly stratified society began to show signs of fluidity, with peasants and workers finding new leverage in a world where their labor was now essential. The trauma of the Black Death left scars that would never fully heal, but it also planted the seeds for transformation. The survivors, bound by grief but driven by the need to rebuild, forged a New England from the ruins of the old. It was a country that had been tested by fire, its people emerging from the devastation with a newfound sense of resilience and a determination to create something better, despite the horrors they had endured. The story of England after the Black Death is not just one of tragedy and loss. It is also a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation. In the face of unimaginable grief, the people of England found a way to rebuild not just their country, but their lives, their communities, and their sense of self. The Black Death left an indelible mark on England, but from the ruins of that destruction came the promise of a new future, one that would shape the course of history for generations to come. The devastation caused by the Black Death left England reeling. Entire villages had vanished, mass graves filled with the bodies of the dead, and survivors were left to pick up the pieces of a society that had once been vibrant and stable. However, as the initial shock of the plague began to subside, the survivors found themselves in a situation they had never experienced before. The world around them had changed, and with that change came unexpected opportunities. What had once been a rigidly stratified society was now in disarray, with a labor force decimated by the plague. Those who had survived found themselves in high demand. There was simply no one left to fill the gaps that had been created by the mass death toll. The world as they knew it had turned upside down, and in the midst of that chaos, survivors discovered a new reality. Their labor had become incredibly valuable. With so many workers gone, those who remained were in a position of power. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about taking control of their own destinies. Wages soared as landowners and lords struggled to find workers to tend their fields, repair their homes, and manage their estates. The sudden labor shortage created an economic shift of unprecedented proportions. What had once been a rigid feudal system, where peasants were bound to the land and at the mercy of their lords, began to crumble. In its place, a new kind of worker emerged, one who understood the value of their labor and, for the first time, was in a position to negotiate for better pay, better working conditions, and greater autonomy. Lords, who had once held all the power and control, found themselves scrambling to keep their estates running. They were used to having peasants who were bound by law to work their land without question, but now, with so many workers lost to the plague, the balance of power had shifted. The surviving peasants were not content to simply accept the old ways. They realized that they had the upper hand, and they were ready to assert their newfound power. The old feudal structure, which had kept the lower classes subjugated for centuries, was now in jeopardy. For the first time, peasants were no longer tied to the land in the same way. They were free agents, able to move between different estates, seeking out the best wages and conditions. The power had shifted from the hands of the lords to the workers who had survived. This was a monumental shift, one that would set the stage for profound social and economic changes in the years that followed. A real-life example of this transformation can be seen in the story of a young laborer from Kent in 1350. He was offered a wage by his lord, but he refused to work for the amount being offered. "If I cannot get what I am worth here, I will go to another landowner," he declared boldly. This was not just about money. It was a statement. It was a moment when the power dynamics began to change, and the laborer understood that his skills and labor were now in demand. He was not simply a servant to his lord. He was a valuable asset in a society that had been decimated by the plague. And so the laborer left, taking his skills to another landowner who was willing to pay a higher wage. This seemingly small act of defiance marked the beginning of a new era. It was a symbol of the power that had shifted to the workers. The old feudal bonds that had held the lower classes in place were no longer as effective, and the surviving peasants, who had once been subjugated to a lifetime of labor for their masters, were now free to negotiate for better conditions. This was a critical turning point in England's history. The Black Death had created a new social reality, one in which the laboring classes had newfound leverage. The traditional feudal system, with its rigid hierarchies and unquestioned authority of the lords, was beginning to erode. As the years passed, more and more peasants and workers began to follow the example of the young laborer in Kent. They demanded higher wages, better working conditions, and more autonomy. They were no longer afraid to challenge their lords and masters, who, despite their attempts to maintain control, were forced to adapt to the new realities of the post-plague world. The scramble for labor was not only economic, it was political and social as well. Lords and landowners, who had once held immense power over their peasants, were now being forced to compete for workers. The laborers understood that they had the upper hand, and they began to assert their rights in ways that had been unthinkable before the plague. Some workers demanded the right to own the land, while others simply sought higher wages and more freedom to negotiate their terms of employment. In response, the nobility and government took drastic measures to maintain control over the labor market. Laws were passed to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and to force laborers to remain on their land, preventing them from seeking higher pay elsewhere. These laws were designed to rein in the rising power of the peasants, but they were largely ineffective. The workers, empowered by their newfound autonomy, often ignored these laws, continuing to demand higher wages and better conditions. They knew that their labor was valuable, and they were willing to risk punishment to secure better terms. The shift in power from lords to laborers was not just about economics, it was about identity. For the first time, peasants realized they had a stake in the future of England. They were no longer just tools of the landowners. They were individuals with rights, with value, and with the power to change their circumstances. The social upheaval that followed the plague did not just change the economic landscape. It shifted the very foundations of English society. As more peasants began to demand better wages and more autonomy, the traditional social order began to crumble. The once unchallenged power of the nobility was now in jeopardy, and the lords found themselves facing a growing sense of unrest. The plague had taken its toll on the population, but it had also laid the groundwork for a new kind of England, one where the workers held power, and the old feudal system was no longer as relevant as it had once been. The transformation was gradual, but it was profound. The Black Death had shattered the old order and left in its wake a society that was more fluid, more open to change. and more willing to challenge traditional hierarchies. The workers, emboldened by their newfound power, would continue to fight for better wages, better living conditions, and more autonomy. They were no longer willing to be bound by the old rules. They were ready to forge a new future. This new era, born from the ashes of the plague, would have a lasting impact on England. The survivors of the Black Death had learned the value of their labor, and they were no longer afraid to demand their worth. What began as a survival mechanism in the face of overwhelming loss became the foundation for a new social and economic order, one that would change the course of English history forever. The impact of the Black Death on England was not only felt through the decimation of its population, but also in the profound shifts it caused in the economic landscape. As the plague wiped out roughly half of the population, it drastically changed the dynamics of labor and resource distribution. In the immediate aftermath, survivors found themselves in a position of power, with a reduced population, meaning that their labor was now in high demand. But it was not just the laborers who experienced change. The very structure of the economy began to shift as well. With fewer people to feed and more land available, many survivors had access to resources they had never had before. Landlords, desperate to maintain their estates, found themselves unable to find enough workers to manage the land. Without the typical pool of laborers to turn to, many landlords had no choice but to pay higher wages to attract those who remained. This was a monumental shift from the past, when wages had been fixed and largely controlled by the ruling class. Now, for the first time, laborers could negotiate their terms, and with this newfound power, they began to demand more, setting the stage for a new economic order in England. The once stagnant wage levels saw a rise, and workers, now in high demand, became an essential part of the country's recovery and growth. But it was not just the laborers who benefited from the plague's fallout. The landowners, many of whom had once enjoyed unchecked control over their estates, were now forced to adapt in ways they had not anticipated. The shortage of workers made traditional farming less viable, as there were simply not enough people to harvest the crops and tend the livestock. In response, some landowners turned to new methods of farming that required less manpower. One such response was a shift toward sheep farming, which quickly became a lucrative alternative. Sheep required far less labor than crops, and wool, in particular, became a prized commodity, essential to the booming textile markets in Flanders and beyond. This shift toward a pastoral economy marked the beginning of a new economic structure in England. The wool trade, which had always been important, became even more central to the economy as the landlords adapted to the shortage of labor. By focusing on sheep farming, landowners could still generate profit without the need for a large labor force. This was not just a short-term fix, it was a long-term response to the realities of a labor-scarce society. The demand for wool grew, and with it, new opportunities emerged for those who were able to adapt to this evolving economy. The economic changes were not confined to the landowners alone. Survivors of the plague found themselves in a new world of opportunity. Many peasants, now with access to abandoned land and fewer competitors, were able to rise above their previous social status. The disappearance of many landowners and the changes in agricultural practices allowed for some to gain control of land that had previously been unattainable. The increased wages and availability of land gave them the resources to thrive in ways that were unimaginable before the plague. Consider the story of the Smythe family, a group of farmers from northern England. Before the plague, they had lived a modest life as small-time laborers, working the land of a local lord. They were part of the peasantry, subject to the control of their lord and living under the rigid constraints of feudalism. But after the Black Death, everything changed for them. With many of the population wiped out and much of the land left abandoned, the Smythes found themselves in a rare position of opportunity. The lord's estate was left largely unattended, and with fewer workers to tend the land, the family was able to claim a portion of it as their own. They inherited a large swath of abandoned land, and, in the process, gained access to resources they had never had before. Realizing the opportunity before them, the Smythe family negotiated a contract with a nearby clothier who was in need of wool for the growing textile market. The family, using their newly acquired land, focused on sheep farming. With a modest initial investment, they were able to establish one of the most profitable wool farms in the region. Within a few short years, they had become wealthy landowners, their wool being sold to markets both in England and abroad. The economic opportunities that had once been reserved for the elite were now within the reach of those who had survived the plague and were willing to adapt. This shift was not unique to the Smythe family. Throughout England, the consequences of the plague created new avenues for wealth and power, particularly for those who were able to adapt quickly. The landless peasants of old were now able to become landowners, often through inheritance or by claiming abandoned land. The rising demand for wool, combined with the increased availability of land, created new economic and social mobility for the survivors. What had once been a strictly hierarchical system was beginning to blur, and new elites, such as the Smythes, were able to rise from the ashes of the old order. While many of the changes brought about by the plague were unsettling and caused significant hardship, they also brought with them opportunities for those who could navigate the shifting landscape. The labor shortage had created a moment of upheaval, but it also provided a chance for a new kind of economic growth to emerge, one that was driven by the resilience and adaptability of England's survivors. The shift to sheep farming was just one example of how the economy adapted to the new realities of the post-plague world. It was a change that would have far-reaching consequences, altering the very structure of English society. In the years following the plague, it became increasingly clear that the world would not return to the way it had been. The economic changes that took place during this period marked the beginning of a new era in England. The rise of wool as a key economic commodity, the shift to sheep farming, and the newfound wealth of former peasants all pointed toward a future that would be markedly different from the past. England's economy was evolving, and in many ways it was becoming more modern, laying the foundation for the future of the nation. Through the story of the Smythe family, we see how the aftermath of the plague opened up new possibilities, not just for individual families, but for the entire nation. The collapse of old power structures and the adaptation of the economy to new realities were defining moments in England's history. These shifts would continue to reverberate for centuries, creating an England that was more resilient, more adaptable, and more prepared for the challenges that lay ahead. The Black Death may have brought devastation, but it also created the opportunity for transformation, and for those who survived, it was a chance to build a new life from the ruins of the old. As the Black Death left its scar on England, the economic shifts set in motion a fundamental change in society. What had once been a rigid feudal system, where peasants were bound by law and custom to serve their lords, was now in a state of flux. The survivors of the plague, empowered by their newfound autonomy and labor value, began to challenge the old order. They were no longer content with the status quo. The nobility, on the other hand, was deeply concerned about the rising assertiveness of the laboring classes and the growing demands for better conditions. The aftermath of the plague had given birth to a new economic reality. Wages were rising, and laborers were no longer bound to their lords in the same way they had been before the epidemic. With a diminished workforce, landowners had to negotiate with peasants, who were now in high demand. But as wages increased and laborers gained power, the social order began to fray at the edges. The system of serfdom that had once kept the lower classes in check was losing its grip. This shift did not go unnoticed by the nobility, who sought to reassert their control through a series of laws and restrictions aimed at curbing the growing power of the workers. One such law was the poll tax, an unpopular tax levied on all adult individuals in England. It was seen as an unfair burden on the lower classes, many of whom were already struggling to survive in the aftermath of the plague. The tax was perceived as a symbol of the ruling class's growing greed and disregard for the suffering of the common people. As the tax burden grew heavier, so did the discontent among the peasants, who were increasingly unwilling to tolerate what they saw as a corrupt and oppressive system. In 1381, this discontent erupted into the Peasants' Revolt, a pivotal moment in English history. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, a charismatic and determined leader, and John Ball, a radical priest who preached equality and the end of serfdom, the revolt was a direct challenge to the power and privileges of the nobility. The rebels, fueled by frustration and anger, marched on London, demanding the abolition of the poll tax and greater rights for the laboring classes. Their rallying cry was simple but powerful. They wanted a fairer, more just society, one where their labor was valued and their voices heard. As the peasants gathered in the streets of London, their numbers swelled, and their demands grew louder. The rebels marched to Mile End and Smithfield, where they confronted the city's leaders. But their ultimate goal was not just to protest, it was to force the king to listen. In a dramatic moment, they managed to confront King Richard II himself, demanding that he address their grievances and grant them the reforms they sought. The king, who was only a child at the time, was caught off guard by the audacity of the peasants, and his royal guards were left scrambling to control the situation. In the heart of the crowd, a particularly brave man stood tall in front of the king's guards and shouted, "We will not be treated as cattle any longer." This moment captured the essence of the revolt. It was a direct challenge to the centuries-old power structures that had kept the laboring classes subjugated. This was not just about money, it was about dignity, rights, and a refusal to be treated as inferior. The peasants, for the first time in history, were standing up to the monarchy, demanding a new social order. The revolt, as we know, was ultimately crushed. King Richard II, under pressure from his advisors and the nobility, promised to address the grievances of the rebels, only to renege on his promises once the immediate threat had passed. The rebels were met with violence, and many of their leaders, including Wat Tyler, were killed. The government quickly restored order, and the poll tax, while temporarily abolished, was eventually reinstated. But the peasants' revolt marked a turning point. It was clear that England's social order was no longer as unassailable as it had once been. The very fact that peasants were able to march to the gates of London and confront the king sent a powerful message that the old ways were no longer valid. The revolt was a flashpoint in a larger movement for change that had been brewing for years. It was a moment when the common people of England began to understand their power. For the first time, they realized that they could challenge the nobility, the monarchy, and the established order. While the revolt was crushed, it laid the groundwork for future rebellions and reforms. The events of 1381 were a reminder that the people would no longer accept their subordinate position in society. They had tasted the power of collective action, and the memory of that taste would fuel further uprisings in the years to come. Real-life stories from the revolt reflect the fierce determination of the peasants. For example, there were many who, like the brave man who confronted the king's guards, stood firm in their belief that the time for change had come. Their actions were not just about protesting unfair taxes. They were about demanding a new world where justice, fairness, and equality could thrive. This was not just a revolt against taxes. It was a revolt against centuries of oppression. As the revolt was crushed and the peasants were forced back into submission, the nobility may have believed they had restored the old order. However, the cracks in the system were now visible. The peasants had shown that they could, and would, rise up when pushed too far. The peasants' revolt did not immediately change the political landscape of England, but it set in motion a chain of events that would eventually lead to the decline of feudalism. It was a symbol of the growing awareness of power among the laboring classes, and it signaled a shift in the balance of power between the monarchy, the nobility, and the common people. In the end, while the peasants did not achieve their immediate goals, they succeeded in shaking the foundations of English society. The revolt showed that no social order, no matter how firmly entrenched, could remain unchallenged forever. The peasants had found their voice, and though it would take time, their demands for a more just and equitable society would eventually be realized. The peasants' revolt was more than just a moment of defiance. It was the beginning of a new chapter in England's history, one where the common people could no longer be ignored. The collapse of the traditional feudal system was one of the most significant long-term consequences of the Black Death. For centuries, England had operated under a rigid structure where peasants, known as serfs, were bound to the land of their lords. These serfs were subject to a life of hard labor, working the fields for their masters, with little to no opportunity for advancement. They were effectively trapped in an economic system that gave them few rights and even fewer opportunities to escape their circumstances. However, the Black Death, which decimated much of the population, forever altered this system. With the death toll mounting, the surviving serfs found themselves in a unique position. The drastic reduction in the population meant that there were fewer workers to maintain the land and perform the labor required by their lords. In this new world, the surviving laborers suddenly had leverage. Their labor had become incredibly valuable, and for the first time, they had the power to demand more for their work. This shift in the labor market was a pivotal moment in English history, marking the beginning of the end for the feudal system. In the years following the plague, many serfs began to slip free from their bonds. They were no longer tied to the land and could move more freely in search of better opportunities. The economic realities had changed drastically, and those who survived the plague understood that they could now demand higher wages and better living conditions. As a result, many serfs abandoned their villages, leaving their lords without workers to tend the land. This mass migration marked the collapse of the feudal order, as serfs sought a life where they could negotiate for better pay and greater autonomy. The old system, which had kept them subjugated for centuries, was no longer viable. Those who remained in their villages also saw their lives change dramatically. With fewer people available to work the land, the remaining serfs were able to negotiate for better conditions. Some demanded fixed rents, which they could now afford thanks to rising wages. The new economic conditions gave them the freedom to challenge the traditional power dynamics and demand fairer treatment. In a society where lords had once held all the power, this shift in the balance of power was a revolutionary change. Take the case of the Darnell family, who had been bound to a local lord's estate for generations. Before the Black Death, the Darnells had lived and worked on the lord's land, subject to the traditional feudal arrangements. They were part of the peasantry, providing labor in exchange for land to farm and protection. Like many families, they had little control over their lives or their circumstances. But after the plague, everything changed. With much of the population wiped out and the lord's estate struggling to find workers, the Darnells saw an opportunity. Rather than continuing to work for their lord, they decided to leave the estate. They packed up their belongings and set up a small farm in a neighboring village, free from the constraints of feudal obligations. This act of defiance was a turning point not only for the Darnell family but for many other families in the same situation. The serfs, who had once been bound to the land, were now free to pursue their own livelihoods. As word spread, other families followed the Darnells' example. They too left the estates they had worked on for generations, taking advantage of the newfound opportunities for independence. The Darnell family's move was not just a personal decision, it was part of a broader shift in the social fabric of England. Across the country, many former serfs took their fate into their own hands. Some sought out better-paying jobs in neighboring villages, while others, like the Darnells, started their own farms. This mass migration of laborers marked the beginning of the decline of serfdom. Within a generation, the feudal system that had held sway for centuries was largely a thing of the past. This transformation did not just affect the peasants. The lords, who had once held all the power, were now struggling to maintain their estates. The labor shortage forced them to adapt to the new economic realities. Instead of relying on the labor of their serfs, who were increasingly unwilling to work for the old wages and conditions, lords had to negotiate for workers. They were forced to pay higher wages and offer better terms in order to attract and retain laborers. In many cases, they were no longer in control of the labor force. Workers could now choose where they wanted to work and for what pay. For the first time, the traditional social structure was being upended. The serfs, once subjugated and powerless, were now in a position of strength. They could demand more for their labor, and they could leave their lord's land to seek better opportunities. The old feudal bonds were weakening, and the survivors of the Black Death were creating a new world for themselves. The changes that began after the Black Death did not happen overnight, but the shift in the balance of power was undeniable. The feudal system, which had kept the lower classes bound to the land for centuries, was on the decline. The Black Death, by decimating the population, created the conditions for this transformation. The surviving peasants, emboldened by the labor demand and the newfound freedom to negotiate, were no longer willing to accept the old order. The story of the Darnell family serves as a powerful example of this transformation. They took advantage of the opportunity that the Black Death created, leaving their lord's estate and setting up a new life for themselves. They were no longer bound by the chains of feudalism, and they found new freedom in a world that had been reshaped by the plague. Their story is not unique. It mirrors the experiences of many others who, through necessity and resilience, broke free from the old feudal order and forged a new path for themselves. In the years that followed, the decline of serfdom continued, and England saw the emergence of a new social order, one where the bonds between laborers and lords were no longer as strong as they had been before. The survivors of the Black Death had built a new world for themselves, a world in which they could demand their worth negotiate for better pay, and, most importantly, break free from the old system of oppression. The death and destruction wrought by the plague had given birth to a new economic and social order, one that would lay the foundation for the future of England. The collapse of the feudal system was not just an economic shift, it was a social revolution, a transformation that changed the lives of those who had once been powerless. The survivors of the Black Death, empowered by their newfound autonomy, created a world that was more fluid, more flexible, and more open to new possibilities. For the first time, they were able to build a future on their own terms, free from the constraints of the old order. The Black Death may have caused immense destruction, but it also opened the door to a new era of opportunity and social change. As the Black Death swept through England, leaving death and devastation in its wake, one of the most significant institutions in medieval life, the Church, found itself facing an unprecedented crisis. For centuries, the clergy had been the spiritual backbone of society, providing not only religious guidance but also a sense of order and comfort in times of hardship. But when the plague struck, it tore through the clergy as ruthlessly as it did the common people, leaving communities without the spiritual care they had relied on for generations. The plague decimated the ranks of the clergy, with many priests and bishops falling victim to the disease. In some areas, entire parishes were left without a spiritual caretaker, and those who remained were often too fearful or ill to perform their duties. This failure of the Church to fulfill its sacred role deeply disillusioned the people. For many, the Church had been a symbol of divine authority, and its inability to care for the spiritual needs of the people during the crisis shattered the trust that had long been placed in it. This breakdown in spiritual care opened the door for reform movements that had been simmering for years. Led by figures like John Wycliffe, a scholar and theologian who became one of the most vocal critics of the Church's wealth and corruption. Wycliffe denounced the Church's lavish lifestyle and the moral decay within its ranks, arguing that the clergy had strayed too far from the teachings of Christ. He called for a return to a simpler, more spiritual form of Christianity, one that was not driven by the pursuit of wealth or power. His criticisms resonated with many who had seen firsthand how the Church had failed to meet the needs of its followers during the plague. But Wycliffe's ideas were just one part of a broader shift in the spiritual landscape of England. The Black Death had forced people to confront their mortality in ways that were deeply personal, and this new awareness of life's fragility had a profound effect on how they approached their faith. As the clergy faltered, lay people, those outside the official structure of the Church, began to take spiritual matters into their own hands. One of the most significant changes was the rise of lay religious movements. People, no longer content to rely solely on the clergy for their spiritual well-being, began to take on more responsibility for their faith. They established new chapels and religious guilds, dedicated to providing spiritual care, prayer, and remembrance for the dead. These movements were grassroots in nature, with no official church endorsement or control. They reflected a deep yearning for spiritual connection in the face of death, and an increasing sense that the traditional authorities of the Church had failed to provide it. In many communities, particularly in the north of England, survivors of the plague came together to create their own places of worship. One such story comes from the town of York, where a group of survivors decided to build a new chapel dedicated to the remembrance of the dead. This was not an official church project. No priests or bishops were involved. It was a spontaneous, grassroots effort by the townspeople, driven by a shared sense of grief and a desire to honor the memory of those who had been lost. The chapel became a symbol of spiritual autonomy, a place where people could come together to mourn, pray, and seek solace, in a time when the church was no longer able to fulfill that role for them. This act of creating a new chapel in York was a profound shift in the spiritual landscape of England. It marked the moment when the control of spiritual matters once tightly held by the clergy began to slip away. People were no longer willing to accept the limitations of the church. They were taking control of their own religious lives. The creation of new chapels and the rise of religious guilds were a form of spiritual self-determination, a way for ordinary people to assert their faith and their right to shape their religious experiences. The rise of lay religious movements also reflected a broader shift in the way people viewed their relationship with God. In the wake of the plague, many people felt a heightened sense of personal responsibility for their spiritual lives. The church, which had long been the intermediary between the faithful and God, was no longer seen as the sole authority. People began to view their relationship with God as something more direct, more personal, and less dependent on the formal structures of the church. This shift in spiritual authority was a fundamental change that would have long-lasting effects on English society. The growing dissatisfaction with the church's failure to provide spiritual care during the Black Death would eventually lead to the rise of Protestant movements and the eventual English Reformation. John Wycliffe's ideas about the corruption of the church and the need for reform laid the intellectual groundwork for these movements. His calls for a return to a simpler, more spiritual Christianity resonated with those who had been disillusioned by the church's inability to care for them during the plague. As people began to question the authority of the clergy, they also began to question the very structure of the church itself. But the shift in spiritual authority was not limited to the religious realm. It also had political implications. As lay people took control of their own religious practices, they began to challenge the political power of the church. The church had long been one of the most powerful institutions in England, with immense wealth and influence. But as the people began to assert their spiritual autonomy, they also began to demand a rethinking of the church's political power. This challenge to the church's authority would eventually lead to the decline of its influence in England and the rise of a more secular society. The story of the chapel in York is just one example of how the Black Death sparked a broader shift in the spiritual and social landscape of England. The plague had forced people to confront the fragility of life, and in doing so it led them to reevaluate their relationship with religion and authority. No longer content to rely solely on the clergy, people began to take matters into their own hands, establishing their own places of worship and seeking spiritual solace in new ways. This shift marked the beginning of a long process of religious reform and change, one that would reshape the religious and political landscape of England for centuries to come. The rise of lay religious movements and the increasing autonomy of the people in matters of faith were just one part of the transformation that took place in the wake of the plague. But they were an essential part of the story of post-plague England, a story of survival, adaptation, and the search for meaning in a world forever altered by death. The creation of new chapels and the rise of religious guilds were symbols of a society that was no longer willing to be controlled by the old institutions. Instead, the people were reclaiming their faith and their power, setting the stage for the religious and social upheavals that would shape the future of England. The Black Death, which began as one of the most catastrophic events in human history, left an indelible mark on England. By the mid-1400s, the country had undergone a remarkable transformation. one that would ultimately lead to the birth of a new, more modern England. The survivors of the plague, though marked by the devastation they had endured, rebuilt their society with resilience, determination, and an eye toward a future shaped by their experiences. The effects of the plague were far-reaching, but instead of simply causing despair, they catalyzed profound economic, social, and cultural changes. The devastating death toll that accompanied the plague meant that the old feudal system, which had defined life in England for centuries, began to unravel. The feudal system, where the majority of people were bound to the land and the will of the nobility, no longer had the same power. The survivors, having gained the leverage of a labor shortage, were empowered to demand better wages, more rights, and a better quality of life. The traditional power dynamics, once unassailable, were now in flux. With the scarcity of labor came a new kind of social mobility that had never been seen before. The old feudal bonds, which had tied peasants and serfs to the land for generations, began to weaken. In the wake of the plague, many peasants were able to demand fixed rents, and in some cases, even leave the land of their former lords in search of better opportunities. The scarcity of workers meant that the labor force had power for the first time in history. It was not just the laborers who benefited, though. Landowners, once able to command servitude, now had to negotiate for workers, offering better wages and conditions to attract laborers. The world, as it had been before the plague, was gone, and in its place was a more fluid, dynamic economy, where workers were valued for their labor. One of the most profound changes brought about by the Black Death was the shifting nature of land ownership. As many people perished during the plague, large swaths of land were left abandoned. Those who survived were able to claim land or demand better terms for the land they worked. The traditional agricultural structure was disrupted, and new opportunities emerged for the common people to take control of their own futures. Land, once controlled by a few wealthy landowners, was now available for those who could afford to take it. This new landscape allowed for social mobility. Peasants, for the first time, could become landowners themselves. With this newfound control over their land and livelihoods, survivors found ways to adapt and thrive. For many, the shift from agricultural labor to more specialized forms of work, such as wool production, offered new economic prospects. The wool industry, which had long been central to England's economy, exploded in importance as landowners turned to sheep farming, requiring fewer laborers, but generating substantial profits from the wool trade. The demand for wool in Flanders and other parts of Europe drove the growth of the wool industry, and it became a primary source of wealth for many landowners and farmers alike. But the economic transformation was not limited to agriculture and industry. The social mobility that emerged in the wake of the Black Death also had cultural implications. As the feudal system began to collapse, people were no longer bound by the rigid hierarchies that had defined their lives. For the first time, there was more fluidity in society. Former peasants and laborers could move freely, negotiate better pay, and seek better opportunities, both economically and socially. The old structures of servitude and subordination began to crumble, giving rise to new opportunities for wealth and status. This greater social mobility was particularly significant in the cities. Urban populations grew as people moved from rural areas in search of work and better living conditions. In the wake of the plague, many survivors migrated to the cities, where there was more opportunity to earn a living and where the demand for labor was high. With the increasing number of workers in the cities, the social hierarchy that had been so firmly entrenched in the countryside was now being replaced by a new, more egalitarian structure. The cities, once dominated by the nobility and the church, began to grow and diversify, with artisans, merchants, and laborers rising to prominence. One of the most striking elements of this new social structure was the growing role of guilds and lay people in shaping the spiritual and social lives of England. In the absence of effective church leadership during the plague years, lay people began to take spiritual matters into their own hands. The growth of religious guilds, independent of the church's control, marked a shift towards spiritual autonomy. People were no longer content to rely solely on the clergy for their religious needs. They began to take charge of their spiritual lives. This shift in spiritual authority, coupled with the increasing mobility of the working class, marked a cultural transformation that would have lasting consequences. By the mid-1400s, the remnants of the old feudal system had largely given way to a new social order. The Black Death, with all of its horror and destruction, had inadvertently created an environment in which England's social, economic, and cultural structures could be reformed. Though the scars of the plague were still visible both in the physical landscape and in the collective memory of the people, the transformation it sparked created a society that was far more modern and dynamic than it had been before the plague. In the aftermath of the plague, one of the most significant lessons was the resilience of the English people. Despite the horrors of the epidemic, they rebuilt their society from the ground up. The survivors were not simply passive recipients of the plague's devastation. They were active participants in the reconstruction of their world. Through hard work, ingenuity, and adaptability, they created new economic realities, forged new social structures, and carved out new opportunities for themselves. This resilience, born of necessity, helped shape the future of England and laid the groundwork for the development of the modern world. But the transformation brought about by the Black Death was not without its challenges. The newfound social mobility and economic opportunities created tensions between the different classes. The nobility, who had once controlled the land and the economy, found themselves struggling to maintain their power in a world where their labor force could move freely and demand better conditions. The growing unrest among the peasants, driven by their newfound economic leverage, would eventually lead to revolts, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where common people directly challenged the power of the monarchy and the nobility. The revolution in labor relations was also mirrored in the growing challenge to the church's authority. The plague, by decimating the clergy, exposed the church's inability to care for the spiritual needs of the people during a time of crisis. This led to a broader cultural and religious shift, which would later contribute to the rise of Protestant reform movements, such as those led by John Wycliffe, and eventually to the English Reformation. In the mid-1400s, England was no longer the same country it had been before the Black Death. The survivors of the plague had emerged from their trials with a newfound sense of resilience and a drive to rebuild a better world. The scars of the Black Death were still visible, but from those scars emerged a more modern and flexible society. The transformation was profound, not only in terms of the economy, but also in the way people interacted with each other, with authority, and with their faith. The Black Death, therefore, was not simply a story of despair. It was also a story of human adaptation and transformation. It taught the English people valuable lessons about resilience, about rebuilding in the face of catastrophe, and about the power of community and cooperation. The survivors did not just pick up the pieces of their broken world. They used the pieces to construct a new, more modern England. The Black Death may have been a time of great loss, but out of that loss came the opportunity for change. And it is through that change that England began its journey toward the modern era. In conclusion, the Black Death marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The economic, social, and cultural transformations that followed the plague helped shape a more dynamic and fluid society. The collapse of the feudal system, the rise of new economic opportunities, and the shift in spiritual authority created a society that was more open to change and better equipped to adapt to the challenges of the future. The Black Death, though a tragedy, was also a catalyst for change, and from its aftermath came an England that was forever altered, more resilient, more adaptable, and more prepared to face the future.